So if you would take a moment, as Danielle, I'm going to let you take over from here and just invite folks to enter their responses into the poll. We do have almost 200 people registered for this 3-week series. You're in week 1 of the 3, so if you can join us for the others as well, great. If not, we will be sending out recordings and resources to all who registered. So thank you, Pastor Danielle.
Yeah, and Michael, if you'll take over admitting people.
Yes.
Okay, awesome. Again, it is good to have you with us today. I'm Pastor Danielle Denise. I am the Director for Evangelical Mission here in the North Carolina Synod, and it is our delight to spend time with you to continue to be encouraged and equipped in the land we find ourselves in right now, which is this land of digital ministry. For those of you in North Carolina, I've been hosting a lot of things, and there was a moment where you thought you were going to get away from me, but I'm still here. And so it is good to see, Ryan probably feels that way too. I mean, Michael and John feel that way. We're hosting a lot of things, but grateful that you are here, grateful that the Spirit has brought you into this place today to learn and to be together. I just want to note a couple things. We're going to ask you to have your microphones muted during our time with Ryan as our presenter to start with this morning, and there will be some opportunity for question and answers, and so we'll ask you to share back. Also, we invite you to turn on your video so that we can see each other's faces and spend time together this morning and know that it's not just something in the cloud, but actual human beings on the other side of this computer screen. And so we're grateful for that. I want to give you a little background on how we ended up here. Pastor Michael and Pastor John from Southeastern and Virginia Synod attended a class with Luther Seminary called Ministry in a Digital Age, and Ryan was teaching it, and Michael and John thought it was so well done that they said, how do we make that happen here in the South? Let's do this together. And they invited me and the North Carolina Synod into the dreaming. And so this is something, although you're going to get notes and emails from the Southeastern Synod, because Michael has agreed to do the logistics. It is a partnership between all 3 of our synods in the Southeastern Synod, Virginia Synod, and the North Carolina Synod. And so we are grateful that digital ministry allows us to work together like this and allows us to come together and see some faces. And if you've moved synods in your journey, you might see a familiar face today. So I hope that is encouragement to you. The only other question that I have, or two other points that I want to make. One is that Pastor Michael will be your technical support. In fact, I think he's going to change his name to say technical support. So if you've got questions or something's going wrong, please feel free to email him or chat him specifically, and he will help you with the Zoom technology. And then if you've got specific questions, if you want to go ahead and put those in the chat, and even if you're like for presenter or for Ryan, so they're easy to find as we go back and have a Q&A time at the end. I'll host that Q&A time towards the end of our time together. So if you have a question and you don't want to lose it, go ahead and put it in the chat, but note that it's for Ryan, so that I can go back and find that easily. So again, we're really grateful to have you. I'm going to pray in just a moment, but we're thankful to have Ryan Panzier here, who is from Wisconsin and I said, where are you from? He said, my basement in Madison, Wisconsin. So we welcome Ryan from his basement. And I want to tell you that the thing that I have loved about Ryan's work, but also on his website and things, is this commitment that theology and digital land are not enemies, right? And in fact, they're going to coexist in a way that glorifies God and invites people into relationship with Jesus Christ. And so that is the center. Ryan is not just telling us technology tricks or tips. Ryan is truly going to invite us into how do we engage the digital landscape so that people encounter Jesus in life-giving ways. And I think that is a beautiful gift for us here this day. And I'm excited for Ryan to do that. Michael, go ahead. Do you
I
have
just
anything to say?
I just wanted to jump in with the poll results just to give us a flavor of who all is here. And this parallels our registration. Can y'all see the poll results now?
Yeah.
Okay, excellent. So about a third from the majority of folks from the Southeastern Virginia, North Carolina synods, and a couple of others. So we're very thankful for all of you to be here. And yeah, take a minute to scroll through the chat box, everyone. You can see where folks are from. Thanks.
Yeah, good. All right, let me just open us in prayer, and then Ryan, I'll hand it over to you. Sound good? The Lord is with you in your basements and in your offices and wherever you find yourself this day. Good and gracious God, thank you. Thank you for the gift of technology that is both a thorn in our side and an opportunity for the gospel to be shared. Lord, we ask that you help us learn and see and take in all of the conversations that we're having today. And even as Ryan shares, may we remember that it is not our goal to be the best at technology, but to be the kind of people who can help create disciples through a digital landscape. Lord, thank you for this time and for the gift of collaboration, the gift of synods, and for the time to come together this day. In your name we pray. Amen. All right, Ryan, take it on over.
Oh, thank you so much, Reverend Danielle, and thank you to everyone who's joining us live on today's call and watching via recording in this time where we have so many Zooms on our schedule, so much going on in the world. I really appreciate you making the time this morning to invest in your own development and to think about how we can use the technologies that connect us to form disciples for this digital age. My name is Ryan Panzer, broadcasting live from my cat's living room, also known as my basement in Madison, Wisconsin. So good to be with you here today. This morning is the first of a three-part webinar series on ministry in a digital age. This morning, we're going to be talking about the case for prioritizing digital ministry. You might be wondering, why do we even need a case to prioritize digital ministry? Here we are 6 months into doing church online. Seems like we've been prioritizing this a lot lately. My hope is that by the end of this session, in about 45 minutes from now, you'll see that digital technology and doing church online is not something that's going to end once the pandemic is over and we get back to some semblance of normalcy. Rather, the church's engagement in a digital space and bringing the proclamation of the gospel to those gathered online is something that is only just getting started and will be something that all of us who work in ministry will be thinking about for as long as we're serving in ministry contexts. I'm really excited to gather with you for 3 consecutive weeks. Next Monday, we'll be diving specifically into worship, and we're going to think not just about some advanced tactics for perhaps jazzing up your virtual worship services, but also some questions about what might happen to worship as buildings start to reopen. And then 2 weeks from today, we're going to engage a question that is top of mind for church leaders everywhere, which is how do we build some semblance of digital community? We have all these tools for broadcasting, we have all these tools for doing worship, but it feels like maybe there's some community missing from our interactions as church. And that's the topic we'll engage in the third and final webinar. You'll see some learning goals here, but my overarching objective for this time is to provide you, the busy church leader, a chance to pause, to reflect on where you've been, and to think about what questions might guide your discernment as you navigate your faith communities into a continued digital future. Feel free to post any questions to the Zoom chat at any point. I know Reverend Danielle and others will be happy to share those out, and I'm happy to take questions throughout the presentation, not just at the end. Just a little bit about my background. I have perhaps a unique vantage point on this intersection of church and technology, having spent my career at these crossroads. I'm a graduate of Luther Seminary, and as I was getting my MA from Luther, I was working full-time for Google in Ann Arbor, Michigan. So throughout my entire career, I've been pulled into these two seemingly different worlds, one which is very high tech and digitally connected, and other not so much. And so I've continued to think through these years as I was a student and after I graduated about how we can bring these two worlds together, because I continue to find that there's more areas of confluence, there's more things that these two worlds have in common than most people even recognize. So all of that came together through a book scheduled to be released on December 1st by Fortress Press. It's called Grace and Gigabytes: Being the Church in a Tech-Shaped Culture. And that book explores what it means to do the work of ministry in this digital age that we're in. It combines some of my experiences in the church, some of my experiences in the tech industry. I do some things at the office that go beyond just playing ping pong and eating snacks, though those are important pieces of work in any tech company. Just another note too is I continue to research, write, and blog about these topics of what it means to bring the worlds of digital technology and Christian ministry together. So today's agenda, we're going to talk about why technology matters, and we're going to do a little retrospective on where we've been as church leaders in the last 6 months. We're going to engage the question of what does it look like for the internet to be our mission field, not just during these days of social distancing, but for always and forever as we move into the digital age. And then we'll close by talking about 3 mindsets that you as a Christian public leader might have in order to do great ministry. That'll segue into our next 2 weeks on the topics of worship and building community. So I want to start by talking about why technology matters for faith leaders like us, and why technology matters, especially now. At the core of this is really a pivot that our culture has made from going online to living online. I think about the contrast between as I was growing up and I accessed the internet through a dial-up connection that prevented phone calls from coming into my house. I would have to sit at a computer in my kitchen, and going online was something isolated, something specific that was an activity I did, but it certainly didn't define my existence or my connections or my interaction with others. If you compare that to today, with high-speed internet, with mobile bandwidth, and with the rise of smartphones, we've really become a culture that no longer goes online as much as we've become a culture that lives online. And I think what epitomizes that perhaps more than anything is the Google search engine. I want to start out this morning by sharing a story of how I spent the first couple of months of my time in quarantine, looking back at April and May. Now, at my house here in Madison, I have this wooden dining room table that we leave out in our backyard because we like to have friends and family over for meals in the backyard. And over the years that it's been outside, we sometimes cover it with a tarp, but it's been exposed to wind and rain and sun, cats and squirrels, and it's gotten a little beaten down. So with a sudden glut of time on my schedule, I decided, well, what would it look like to refinish that table? And I had to learn. I'd never refinished anything before. I'm not much of a handyman. So I asked Google a question, and how do I refinish a dining room table? The Google search engine, this ubiquitous piece of digital technology, not only showed me how to go about refinishing the dining room table, but it also gave me several questions to continue my search, to further my own exploration. Google didn't just say, here's the 3 steps that you have to take, here's the 4 steps that you have to take to refinish a table. It also encouraged me to go further into the costs of refinishing. Turns out they're higher than estimated. How long it takes to refinish a dining room table. Turns out it takes longer than I expected. And how do you restrip and restain a dining room table? Turns out with a lot of mistakes along the way. But all of these things I learned from accessing this search engine, this digital technology. And as I was learning how I finish this dining room table of mine, my mind kept thinking about, and maybe if I learn how to refinish a table, there's other things in life that I might learn from digital technology as well. Oops. What you'll see on this slide is a illustration of search volume on Google's search engine for the question, who is Jesus? And this tracks search queries worldwide going back to May of 2008. Now, this is a normalized index of search query volume, and if that sounds complicated, it's actually fairly straightforward. You see the number 25 here, you see the number 100 right here. From 2008 until today, we've seen a 4x increase in the number of people who are going on to Google and looking for information about who is this Jesus? What does Jesus have to do with me? I think that's pretty interesting. I think that's even more interesting in the fact that it's translating into spiritual practice. It's translating to scripture study that's done online, independent of any church community. Culture, our tech-shaped culture, is turning to digital technology and is studying the scriptures and is looking at prayer and is exploring who Jesus is for them. Now, here's the kicker that sometimes church leaders, have a little grimace on their face when I show this next one, because these are search queries. This is the interest in search query church over time. Today, there are one third fewer search queries for churches than there were 10 years ago. So even though there's this sudden increase with digital technology and looking for who Jesus is, what the scriptures are all about, how we engage certain digital practices, we're not necessarily looking for that information first and foremost through church. And that's why I think it's so important to bring these two worlds together. Not because technology is something that we use to get things done, or it's something we use to connect with one another, but because technology is being used by many people to think about their spiritual identity, to think about their walk with God, to think about what it means to be a disciple. They're asking those questions, and so it behooves us as church leaders to be able to meet them where they're at. Now, I found it especially interesting that as the United States navigated some of the darkest days of the COVID-19 pandemic, looking back towards the end of April and early May, when deaths in the United States, particularly on the East Coast, were at their highest, Google saw more search queries on the search term prayer than it ever had before. So again, people are looking for the gospel story. They're searching for God with Google. They want the message that we have to share. The question for us as church leaders is, how will we show up to meet them there? So we're going to accomplish that by thinking about the internet not as a set of tactics or some media. It is tactics, and it is media, and it's buttons, and it's screens, and all those things are certainly true. But for us in church specifically, the internet is a mission field. And so what I want to present is a little bit of an ecclesiology for doing digital ministry, for doing the work of church online. I want to start with this quote from Martin Luther. The noblest and greatest work and the most important service we can perform for God on earth is bringing other people, and especially those who are entrusted to us, to the knowledge of God by the Holy Gospel. So we're not using the internet because it's a tactic, or we're not using the internet because it's a thing we do. We're using the internet because it is how those who are entrusted to us, those in our neighborhoods and those in our faith communities, can be brought to the knowledge of God by the way of the gospel. I want to stop there actually to engage a question from Dave Fox. So Dave asks, it scares me that Google teaches people about Jesus, scripture, and prayer. Is it just me, No, Dave, it's not just you. In fact, it scares me a little bit. If you want to really get scared by that question, look at the advertisements at the top of the search query, "Who is Jesus?" Click on some of those ads and see some of the theological claims those websites have to make. There's some perhaps dubious things on some of those websites, which is just another summons for us to show up in these spaces. The church is already being represented in digital landscape. Google doesn't necessarily have a filter that's going to look for only the answers that have the best theology, or the answers that are the most well discerned by intelligent, thoughtful church leaders. They have their own motivations and their own algorithms. So the church is being represented in these spaces, and sometimes not the way we might want the church to be represented. Going back to that question about bringing the gospel to those closest to us, to our neighbors and to our neighborhoods, this is not a question of bringing the gospel to the millennials or to Generation Z. I'm an older millennial myself, so I'm in this category where 93% of my generation owns a smartphone. I'm actually surprised it's not higher. But if you look at the Pew data, which has this great demographic breakdown of generations and how they access digital technology, you'll see that every generation, including those born before 1945, has, if not a majority, at least a rapidly growing share of folks that are using the internet, that own a smartphone, that own an iPad, that use social media. I love this statistic about 28% of those born before 1945 use social media in some way. I think about my my grandma, before she passed away, became a big user of Instagram so she could connect with her grandkids. So I always show this data to remind us that we're not just thinking about fishing for millennials when we're having these conversations. Our entire community, all of those entrusted to our care, show up in these spaces. Facebook, by the way, is rapidly growing with older generations. I think sometimes there's this sentiment that Facebook is a declining social network. It's not as trendy as TikTok, Snapchat, or Instagram. I would like to point out that Facebook has seen growth in every generational cohort every single year of its existence. Excuse me for 1 second, just need to grab a sip of water.
No problem. Again, if you've got question and answers, go ahead and put those in the chat bar. And just want to mention, as Ryan's taking a sip of water, Pastor Michael shared this in the chat, but we will send you all of these slides. So if you are like, I'm grateful, shocked, a little have to figure out that piece about prayer being, I'm not most searched during COVID. So you'll have these slides. You'll have an opportunity to share these with leaders in your congregations, and those will be sent out, I think on Wednesday, Pastor Michael said, to you all. So again, we will make sure that you have these slides and these statistics as we keep going. Ryan, you good?
Yeah, the air quality is really good in Madison, Wisconsin, compared to places out west, but the level of tree pollen is off the charts. So it's messing with my Monday morning a little bit. Since COVID, some of this data has accelerated. Some of these trends are moving even faster. Think about Facebook, which had 150 million daily users prior to the pandemic. Facebook has seen a 27% increase in daily usage. Netflix and YouTube not far behind, and the degree of scale there is immense. I mean, the 27% increase to bring it up to 170 million users per day almost makes me wish I would have invested in Facebook and Zoom 10 years ago when they went public. But I think that this is to say, we're not just dealing with a community that is deeply connected to these spaces. At times, we're also dealing with a community that's over-connected. And that's going to inform some of our questions about community building when we look ahead to the third webinar series, or the third webinar in this series. Barbara asks, do you have stats for Zoom use? Barbara, there are many statistics on Zoom use, and in the email we send as a follow-up, I'll include a link. But here's the article. It's the New York Times, "The Virus Changed the Way We Internet." I believe that's the article that has changed over time with Zoom usage. I think that, I'm pretty sure the statistic is the average internet user spends, or the average worker has 3 Zoom calls a day right now. On the opposite side of the spectrum, I love to share this quote as well. You're going to seminary online. It's a shame. You'll lose out on experiencing that community. I don't know who said this to me. They were wearing a clerical collar. I learned that they were retired, and they had found out that I had just started taking classes about 8 or 9 years ago at Luther Seminary. So when we look at these trends where our culture has shifted online, we also have this side of us where, as church, where we kind of have to grapple with the history of moving, not necessarily slowly, because moving slowly can be advantageous, but there's a dimension of the church that's been reluctant to think seriously about what digital technology can do from a ministry standpoint. 55% of churches didn't have a website prior to COVID-19. 2/3 of our churches offered Wi-Fi, but that still means 1/3 of our churches didn't have internet connections in the building. And about, flip a coin, that's the odds that a church was using social media on prior to COVID-19. So all of this to say, we have our work cut out for us. We shifted online very quickly back in March, but we still have some ground to catch up. Jennifer Roberts asks, in what ways can we encourage those still trying to become comfortable with technology, especially our old generations? Yeah, so great question, Jennifer. I think the key word there is encouragement, to provide a positive and affirming voice, so that anyone who's learning technology feels welcomed and feels encouraged, learning technology at their own pace, right? I think it's really easy for somebody like myself, who grew up as what's referred to as a technology native, to sometimes come across as moving too quickly, or as even sometimes speaking a word of judgment on those who are not as fluent in technology. So I frequently offer to my peers an encouragement to be patient, to be graceful, to remember that not everyone has the same level of comfort. And a lot of churches are doing interesting things right now to train their communities to use technology. I was talking with the Northwest Mountain Synod, and they have pastors in rural Idaho where those who are watching church online from home are connecting to the internet one time per week, and that's to watch church. So some have printed handouts, some have created instructional DVDs. There's many different creative ways I've seen to help those in the community to become more fluent and more able with technology.
Can I add one thing to that too, Ryan? One of the best ways in that is to engage your young children. And I'm not talking about like making it a confirmation project that they feel like, oh, I'm required to do, like setting up chairs in a building or something like that. But Ryan, you mentioned your grandma getting on Instagram so she could connect with grandkids. What does it look like to show someone how to use a FaceTime or a Zoom so that they can a conversation with a second grader in your congregation, where the ultimate benefit of it is more relationship and not just check how to use Zoom, right? That there's a lot more incentive to sign on when you're getting your congregation to develop a relationship as you teach them some technology pieces.
Yeah, thank you for that. That's excellent. I know at my church, prior to the pandemic, we launched an app, and we had our high school youth group tabling outside the sanctuary and teaching anyone in the community to use the new app that we had just launched. Just a couple of other questions that have come up here. John asks how many churches have joined the internet since the pandemic. And yeah, John, there is a group called the Barna Group that has some statistics on this. Ultimately, I think that data is still a little fragmentary. We don't really know. From my conversations, it seems like near 100% of churches have in some way done some digital engagement. But specifically with these statistics on website usage and social media, we're not necessarily sure where those figures are at just yet. And then Brian, who is actually one of my classmates at Luther, had a comment about the distributed learning programs, about how exceptional they are at building community for today's church. Brian mentions the cohort style interactions. And one thing that Brian probably experienced, I know I experienced at Luther, was when we would gather on campus for 1 or 2 weeks of the year, it felt like a family reunion. It was just this joyous occasion where everybody was brought together and everyone was so eager to see one another. The faculty would frequently ask, like, how is the community so strong with this distributed learning program? Like, how does everyone like each other this much? It's really a testament, I think, to why digital spaces are so important. And one more question from Emily here. Will you please give us more information on creating an app, but it looks expensive? Yeah, it is. So Emily, that's a great question. App development is one of the most expensive tactics that a church can engage in the digital age. I would, before anybody invests in creating an app, I would really encourage you to think about what an app allows you to do that a website or a social media account doesn't already afford you. For my church in particular, where we have 5,000 to 6,000 members, we felt it was a really great way to share content across all of these different worship services and 2 campuses to kind of connect people. But not every congregation needs an app. And as with all technology, it's really important to ask the why question to critically engage, why would we want to use that technology? Just to quickly share a little photo diary from my life. Going back to March 6th of 2020, I was at a chili cook-off at my church with 350 some folks, everybody eating chili out of crock pots. There was no plexiglass, there were no face masks. This is me on March 8th doing a children's sermon with a packed sanctuary, lots of kiddos. Fast forward 6 days and an email came out that we were still going to do church, but we wanted those with prior medical conditions to consider not taking communion. And only the next day did we learn that the service would be moved entirely online. This has moved very quickly. If you have a chance to go back through old emails or old photos, I think it merits a moment of pausing and reflecting to realize where you've been and how fast you've adapted and how well you've led your organizations, your churches through these times. We hear the word unprecedented so much, it's almost been a cliche, but I think what organization has adapted so quickly and learned so fast and grown so much is the church. Perhaps schools and churches are the two types of organizations that have moved the fastest and learned the most and adapted the most dynamically throughout all of this. A quote here from Deanna Thompson. She has a wonderful book called The Virtual Body of Christ in a Suffering World. Deanna is an academic who began as a little reluctant to think about digital technology in Christian contexts. And then Deanna was diagnosed with cancer and found that the community she experienced on her Caring Bridge website was really what kept her moving through some of the hardest days of her diagnosis. Just to call out her quote here, that it was shocking to realize that through virtual connectedness via a website, I was surrounded by a cloud of witnesses greater than any I could have previously imagined. If you've seen Caring Bridge, you know it's a great way to connect those who are suffering through an illness or through long-term hardship with a loving and supportive community. Caring Bridge is also a very simple technology. It's effectively an online bulletin board where you can exchange messages. And I think an example of how, as church, our technology adoption doesn't have to be complex. It just has to proclaim the gospel, to show Jesus to those who are gathered online. I also like this quote from Heidi Campbell, who's a scholar of media and religious studies. When I talked to her as part of the research for my book, Heidi shared that the internet today, digital technology, is the parallel to what St. Paul had with his letter writing going back 2,000 years. Faith in the offline world was about relationality and connection. It's no different in the digital age. Ministry online is still about relationships. It's still about connecting, and it's still about starting conversations. So what I want to leave you with then today is our three mindsets for successful digital age ministry. And each of these mindsets we'll come back to in the next 2 weeks when we dive specifically into the topics of worship and community building. The first mindset that I want you to think about is that our culture matters an awful lot more than our technology. So rather than starting out thinking about apps, websites, videos, tools you can use as part of digital ministry, what I encourage church leaders to think about is how the way the church is viewed is a little different from the values that our tech-shaped culture shares in common. Fast forward this here. One thing that when I talk to a lot of my coworkers in the tech industry is they seem to think, perhaps rightly so, that the church has an awful lot of proclamation. It's kind of bent on this idea of proclamation. And where they really think, or where their minds are really at, is this idea of questions. And you see this with the Google search engine. You see this with Siri. You see this with Alexa. All of these are devices that encourage us to ask a lot of questions. When I talk to my coworkers about religion, they don't always see the church as a place that welcomes and affirms the question. Fairly or not, the opportunity for us as church leaders is to think about, before we even have a conversation about what technology we use, think about how we can be an institution that celebrates questions and questions about faith. Again, fairly or not, when I talk to my coworkers in the tech industry, they often use the word hierarchy to describe religion. Oh, well, the church, just too much hierarchy for my liking. And that's fair, because they come from a world that is first and foremost about collaboration. You see this with Google Docs and real-time editing software that allows coworkers from across the world to join forces on a PowerPoint or a Word document. You even see this with Zoom, which is a way that brings the world together to work when everyone's sitting in their basements and living rooms trying to do homeschool and also be at the office at the same time. The question for us as church leaders is, in what ways can we make our ministries truly collaborative? You'll see this a lot next week as we think about next steps for virtual worship. Opening up our service to more collaborative participation from the community is perhaps a more powerful next step than anything about adding song lyrics or QR codes or giving via text message. Another thing we see, and this one has changed a little bit, is the assumption that the church is an in-person institution. It's a building that is open on Sunday mornings, and beyond that, well, we don't really know. And again, that's the assumption that my coworkers in the tech space have. They come from a world that is built on hybrid connection, where it's completely normal and in fact encouraged to be simultaneously offline and online. And I don't mean that it's normal to be distracted so much as when I have meetings back when the office was open, every meeting has a video chat. Every meeting is inclusive of those who are not gathered in the conference room. When you think about like the way the church has grown and evolved in recent months, it's this movement into embracing virtual connection that's seen the most movement, that's seen the most growth, and the one I'm the most optimistic about. As we go forward, and we'll talk about this a lot next week, the question is, how can we continue to embrace virtual connection even as our buildings start to reopen? I just want to call out a comment from Jonathan Conrad here. One bright spot. Now know our CCLI and one license account numbers by heart. Very good. And finally, one other mindset that should be considered in the church is this idea of creativity. And again, fairly or not, when I talk to my coworkers about the spirituality, they see church as a sit and get experience. You go to hear a sermon, you go to watch a service. The pivot that we might make in the church is how we can embrace more forms of creativity and involvement. This is going to come into the conversation in 2 weeks when we talk about community building. So engaging those 4 values, questions, collaboration, hybrid connection, and creativity, are kind of the foundations that we need to be thinking about when we're engaging this question of how do we do effective ministry in a digital age. The third mindset that I want to leave us with today is the mindset of digital minimalism. And this one is an interesting one for somebody who talks a lot about church and technology. But digital minimalism is the idea that we only ought to use those technologies that align most closely to our values and specifically to our mission and vision. If technology doesn't support our mission and vision, then why would we use it? And there's good reasons to have that focus. The world of technology is moving so quickly that even those who live in the world of technology can't possibly keep up with it. Nobody can. So if you start with the mission and you start with your why, the technology usage will take care of itself. You'll learn the tactics, you'll become comfortable with them, you'll figure out what's going to work for your context. But you don't need to try everything. And in fact, you really shouldn't. There's a great book from Cal Newport, who's a professor of computer science at Georgetown University, called Digital Minimalism: Choosing a Focused Life in a Noisy World. And the thesis of that book is that technology is a tool. It should serve our goals and our values and our purposes, but our lives, our time doesn't serve technology. So I always keep that in mind as we start conversations about using tech, is that technology is a tool that serves us. We are not tools that serve technology. So a few takeaways to think about, specifically as we look towards the next 2 weeks. The first is the idea of permanence. The pandemic is going to end someday. Digital ministry will not. fact, we're really only getting started. The idea of planning. Going back to those weeks in March, my church moved online in one day. we went from church is going to be open to church is closed, or the building's closed, and we're online in less than 24 hours. We can afford to be thoughtful and strategic, though, about where we go next. We don't have to move at that rapidity again. Thank goodness for that. So we'll think a lot about planning. And lastly, the idea of perseverance. This is hard work. Getting an organization that has lagged the broader culture to suddenly be a thought leader about technology is going to be tough. So let's learn this with grace and patience, affirming all of those, not just those who are slower to learn technology, but everyone is along for this journey.
Ryan, thank you for that. You want to keep going with this real quick before we do questions?
Yeah, just have a couple of quick resources I want to share. I see some questions, and we'll get to those in just a minute. There are three books, hopefully four, if I might add mine to the mix. But there are 3 books that are out now that I would consider to be part of the digital ministry book bag. 3 books I have on my shelf that I would recommend having on yours as well. One is the Virtual Body of Christ by Deanna Thompson. That's an excellent book for answering the question of why digital, and for convincing those that are reluctant to think about digital ministry at any time, let alone after the pandemic ends. The second book is Click to Save Reboot by Keith Anderson and Elizabeth Drescher. Keith is a Lutheran pastor, and Elizabeth is an academic in California. Click to Save Reboot is the most up-to-date how-to guide for church leaders on how to do the tactics of the digital age, how to create a website, how to curate a social media feed, how to get started with podcasting. And then the third book I'd recommend is also by Elizabeth Drescher. It's called Choosing Our Religion, The Spiritual Lives of America's Nuns. It really does a good job of breaking down some of those trends I showed earlier with the Google search data, that the internet is a source of profound spirituality, and it's up to us in the church to think about how we might be there as well. I just want to put in a plug too for 2 places that offer boot camps, trainings, conferences, webinars, and courses on digital ministry. One is the eFormation Learning Community from Virginia Theological Seminary and Episcopal Seminary, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with that. They offer a number of excellent resources, as well as Luther Seminary's Faith Lead program, which has ongoing classes, as well as asynchronous content that you can access to engage these topics further. And just because I am a podcast aficionado, 2 podcasts I really love by professors of mine. One is New Time Religion by Andy Root. It's a podcast about being the church, specifically being a pastor in a digital age. The Gospel Beautiful podcast by Michael Chan. And the third one is a little out there. So, I'm not endorsing their theology necessarily, but it's interesting to get a pulse on like how our broader culture is thinking about religion. It's called the Liturgists podcast. I would especially recommend season 1 of that podcast in thinking if you want to kind of go down the rabbit hole of how is our broader culture thinking about religion and thinking about technology. All right, last 2 resources, and then we'll go into some Q&A. So I do offer a weekly-ish newsletter where I produce ministry tips for digital technology. I'm currently doing a series on different digital marketing tactics like Google Analytics and Facebook. You can sign up for that on my website. It's right on the homepage. And then if you want to read the book, you can actually get a free preview chapter now from Faith Lead. I'll send this out with the slides, and then the book comes out on December 1st. Okay, last thing I want to mention, there is a pre-order discount for those of you for being a part of the book kickoff tour, which I guess this webinar series is unofficially a part of the book kickoff tour. Can't go and speak anywhere in person. So this is it. Fortress Press is offering a 30% discount code with the code Panzer30.
That's great. You're allowed to self-promote, Ryan. It's okay. We're glad to have you here.
Wonderful.
It's good. Well, Ryan, there's a couple specific questions about technology, like Tidely and some of those things. But before we get to that, and I'm sure you've encountered this when you've done webinars, is like I sit here and I'm like, yes, exactly. We've got to be talking about this. We're redoing our Synodical website, and I've been thinking here, like, if someone Googled prayer, how would our Synod website come up? Because we just tell people things. When you talked about questions, I felt like, oh, good gracious, because I'm knee deep in that right now. But then there are people who are like, I don't care that Jesus is in my building and wants to be in my building, and I don't want to do technology, or they aren't that growing minority or that growing population that's hopping online even though they're before 1945. What do you tell them? But also, what do you tell their pastors and deacons? Because part of what I want to tell them is, like, Jesus also said, shake off the dust, and I'm not a bishop or anybody in charge, so I feel like I can say that. But how do we actually have those conversations with people who are like, yeah, I just don't need this. I just want to be back in my church with a hymnal. Like, what do you do?
Well, I think there's a couple questions within that. So the first is the question of how do you convince those, how do you reach those that are really reluctant to think about digital technology in the church? And it's about going back to this idea of the Great Commission and what does it mean to make disciples. And I mentioned this in the blog post I wrote, but making disciples, quote, of all nations almost makes us think of making disciples in these physical places. But we live in a culture where many of us are spending right now 8 to 10 hours a day online. My address, my place of residence is probably more digital than anything having to do with the number on my mailbox. So if we think about convincing anyone of the value of digital, it has to start with that idea of what does it mean to make disciples, and where are we making disciples of these days, and where else if not digital spaces. Now that other question, which was about what with those who just want to be back in the building, is a question about our communities. And I think it's okay to want to be back in the building. I want to be back in the building when it's safe. I miss my community. I mean, I'm a total techie, and I don't ever see myself going to church 52 weeks a year on Facebook Live once all this is over. It's going to take some community building, I think, to help those who are asking those questions. To recognize the value of digital. And one of the challenges with how we've done church the last several months, all of the focus on streaming and broadcasting worship has done a great job of broadcasting, but not always building the community. There's a lot of challenges with building community, which we'll think about in 2 weeks. So I would leave that question on a little bit of a cliffhanger, if that's all right.
You are absolutely allowed to do that. Let me say two things for those of you in Virginia, North Carolina, and Southeastern. One of the things that directors for evangelical mission help congregations do is name your why and name your values. And those are things that you're hearing are at the center of even these conversations. How do we help name that, and how do we cling to that? So if you need help in the why and values piece, I would encourage you to reach out to your DEM to have some conversations with your congregation. There was a question about phone-in options and things like that. Michael, I know you all use a phone-in service, and so does the North Carolina Synod. We use something called All Clients, and so maybe we can include some pieces about that, Michael, in the email that goes out about a way you can do recorded services with people who the only option is a phone, and what that might look like. And other than your book, because I would say we could encourage this book, if you were going to have a council read a book together, what would it be?
I would have to recommend any of Keith Anderson's books are great places for Lutheran churches, and specifically to start with. His Click to Save Reboot is a good field guide. Another one that isn't on here is called The Digital Cathedral. I believe it's called Wireless Ministry in a Networked World. Keith is just a very thoughtful thinker for Lutheran context specifically. And you send him an email, he'd probably join a Zoom with your council to talk more about it.
Awesome. Other questions? I know there's a question about Tithely, which I think we can get to Tithely.
Yeah.
But then also, can you speak on how to evaluate dynamic changes made during this time? So we're making changes real quick, and then we're making changes on those changes real quick. How do we do that with discernment and with evaluation woven into it?
So the first tip I would provide is to make sure you're measuring something, whether you're measuring the number of attendees at worship, or whether you're measuring your website with a tool like Google Analytics. Have some kind of a source of data, and don't make those evaluations just based on assumptions. The other,
or the loudest mouth,
or the loudest
right?
mouth,
because they're usually not the happy ones. So,
and the thing I want you to think about too is what you're trying to do. What all churches are trying to do here is build a brand new digital platform, and it takes a lot of time. All of these algorithms like Facebook and Google, they want to show the best resources that get the most eyeballs and clicks, and so they're going to prioritize content that has been engaged with at high levels in the past. So if you're building something, or you're recording something, you're broadcasting something, and it's not getting a lot of traction, be patient. Give it 4 to 6 weeks before you really make a definitive judgment on how it's performing for you. But if you do those two things, measure and you are methodical and patient with making decisions and evaluations, it's always okay to say something's not working. Let's move on and try something else.
That's helpful. Ryan, we're at our time, so we're going to close that. But my last question is just like 2020 is not fun. And in fact, I see her on here, one of the pastors in our synod said, 2020 has been filled with the good idea fairy, that everybody has a good idea for their pastor and their deacon. And we declared in North Carolina that we wanted to kill the good idea fairy, because we want to simply not have everybody's opinions guiding this. You've got leaders, you've got rostered ministers, you've got deacons and pastors. What's your one piece of advice for us in this time as we move through it, when people are sort of kicking and screaming, I don't want to do digital? How do you just encourage us? Maybe it's a dumpster fire. What do you tell us? What are we going to do?
You're doing an amazing job. You've learned so fast. You've moved so quickly. The idea fairy is always going to be whispering in your shoulder, but keep reminding the idea fairy how far you've come. Because like I said earlier, nobody's as good of job as church leaders in these last 6 months. So it is hard work, but celebrate how far you've come so far.
If I had a kazoo, I'd play a kazoo for all of you. You're doing it. You're making it work. Karen Morse, you have a great question here about the digital landscape supporting the brick and mortar. And maybe we can talk a little bit about that in the next 2 weeks, Ryan, if we can add that to your presentation for us, that'd be great.
Certainly.
We will be back next week. Same link, right, Pastor Michael? Same link,
correct.
Same time. John Wirtz will be our host, so North Carolina Synod, the chance to have somebody other than me hosting for you. So we'll be glad to have y'all on, and thank you for your time today, and expect an email from the Southeastern Synod and Pastor Michael with slides and links and all that good stuff. Ryan, thank you for your time today.
Blessings to you all. We'll see you next week.
All right. Goodbye, everyone. Thank you.